Hi, good morning, and welcome to another episode of Breakfast by the Bay. Thanks for joining us here at Save the Bay again. My name is Jen. Behind the camera, we have Captain Eric with us today, and today we're going to be talking about watersheds. So, behind me here, you have our Narragansett Bay Watershed Map. And so, all of these colors, all this colored land here, is Narragansett Bay's watershed. Now, what is a watershed? A watershed is an area of land that drains its water down into a body of water that's at a lower elevation. So you can imagine that all of this land around here is up at a higher elevation, so the rainwater will then drain off the land and head on down, eventually making its way down to Narragansett Bay. You can see here on our map that we have different sub-basins. We have them all labeled in different colors, and those sub-basins are connected to different rivers. So, for example, up here in the green, we have the Blackstone River Basin. So the Blackstone River stretches all the way up here from the city of Worcester in Massachusetts and travels its way down here, making its way into Providence and down here to Narragansett Bay. So all of these sub-basins connect to Narragansett Bay, bringing its fresh water supply. Now, the Narragansett Bay watershed is over 1,500 square miles large. And it is extremely large, as you can see here, and it stretches into 2 states. So we have Rhode Island here, but you'll notice that a good portion of the watershed actually extends out into parts of Massachusetts. Not all of Massachusetts, but just some parts here, labeled as the Taunton River Watershed and the Blackstone River Watershed. And actually, 60% of the watershed falls out into Massachusetts, and the remaining 40% are here in Rhode Island. Now, that's extremely important to know, because it means when we're working on making laws to protect the bay, we not only have to work with our own legislation, but we need to also work closely with Massachusetts, because whatever happens out here in these watersheds will have an effect on Narragansett Bay. And now it's really important to understand where our watershed is, because like I said, what we do on our land affects the water. If we're doing something out here in these watersheds, the rivers make their way bringing that down into the bay. So it's really important to be able to work with both Rhode Island and Massachusetts to make sure that we're trying to keep Narragansett Bay clean and healthy. And we also know that parts of outside the watershed do not lead down into Rhode Island, and that's because surrounding or outlining the watershed are the highest elevations, right? So you can imagine a really, really big hill along these lines, these borders. So if it rained right on the line, the rainwater could either flow downhill that way or downhill into our watershed. But even parts that are not in our watershed here in Narragansett Bay, they are a part of some watershed. Land all around the world is a part of a watershed. The rainwater has to travel somewhere. It's just that these parts out in the white are not connected to Narragansett Bay's watershed because those higher elevations are keeping that rainwater separate and going elsewhere. So, like I said, it's over 1,500 square miles large. Really hard to show you on this actual map or actually outside. So, we have a model here. And this is our watershed model. It's going to demonstrate exactly what happens in real life out in a watershed. So let me point out some of these things we have here. First off, to start off, we have things like dirt, and we have grass and roads, and then we have some rivers and streams that lead down here. This is going to be our Narragansett Bay. It will represent the bay. Then we have some man-made structures that have been added to our watershed. We have a nice residential neighborhood over here with some houses. We have a school. We have a shopping plaza I usually call this our mega mall, so that any store and restaurant, everything's in here, located in the mega mall. We have bridges connecting our roads together, leading to a factory, leading to a safety complex, could be a hospital, could be a fire station, a police station. We also have some farmland down here, and it has some animals and a lot of land to grow some crops. And then lastly, we have what's called a wastewater treatment facility. And what that does is that takes wastewater from people's homes that are connected to underground sewers, and any of the water that goes down their drains, all that dirty water, that gray water, goes to this wastewater treatment facility, and it gets cleaned up. And it goes through a long process. Usually it takes about 12 hours to clean the water that's coming in from start to finish. So it's a really, really big cleaning process to get everything out of the water, so that when they release the water back out into a local river or into the bay, it's really clean. And hopefully it's removed a lot of the stuff that would normally pollute the bay. So these are extremely important. But it looks a little too clean from what I see sometimes. And so I want to talk to you quickly about some different kinds of pollutants that can make their way onto our land. And then we can talk about how this might affect the water. So the only thing I'm going to show you today is pollution that can be on the land. Yes, we have air pollution that comes from different sources, but we're going to talk about things we can actually visualize here and things we can see. So I'm going to start off with the most common type of pollution, and that is litter, right? Litter is often seen around neighborhoods, around the school, by a factory, maybe on the roads. And litter would basically be anything that you would put in your trash or in your recycling that somehow maybe blew out of your trash can and is now found scattered about on the roads in the neighborhoods. So that's litter, anything that should be going in the trash or something thrown away. The next thing we have is sewage. Now, sewage is obviously at our wastewater treatment facility, right? They're the ones cleaning it up and helping to protect the bay. But also, we can find sewage in different places. So if you have pets that go to the bathroom outside, then you might have some dog waste around in your backyard or around in the street if you're taking your dog for a walk or your pet is going to the bathroom outside. That's another form of waste or sewage. And then we also have some over at our farm, where our farm animals are, right? So there's usually some manure along the farm, all different types of waste or sewage, but they all exist around in our watershed. All right, then we also have chemicals, right? Chemicals come in different forms, even just things like soap are chemicals. So if you're washing your car outside, maybe cleaning some windows, using chemicals at the factory could be possible, and maybe you even use chemicals at the farm or in your gardens, and those might be used for things like pesticides, or something you're using to keep those bugs and things off of your crops so that they don't eat it all and ruin it for you. The next thing we have to kind of go along with that is fertilizer. Now, fertilizer is full of nutrients, and plants love fertilizer. So you might use it on your lawn, you might use it to fertilize your flowers, your own garden at home. You might also use fertilizer at the farm, right? They definitely want those crops, those vegetables and fruits and things to grow fast and to grow big. And so fertilizer is another form of pollution And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a minute, but let's finish focusing on the different kinds. The last one is oil and gas pollution. And that you might find from an old car that has an oil leak maybe. If you've ever seen a nice rainbow puddle in a parking lot or in your driveway, that's usually an indication that there's an oil leak. But we might also find it around the gas station, if there's a gas station around, to help these cars fill up for fuel. So oil and gas is another form of pollution. So right there, we've just named 5 different kinds of pollution. Oil and gas, fertilizers, chemicals, sewage, and litter, right? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to see what happens when a rainstorm comes through our watershed. Because our land right now looks pretty dirty. It's got quite a bit of pollution on it. So let's see what happens when it rains. This is going to be more like a hurricane coming through because I really want you to see what happens. So what happened? Where did all of the rainwater go? Where did all of the pollution that was on our land go? Well, the rain is pretty powerful. The rain is powerful. Even the wind can do this too. It can move this pollution around, right? So when it rained, that rainwater, if you've ever seen it, you might have seen it kind of like rushing down the street, making a little river going to the nearest storm drain, and it travels over the ground and pushes all of this down to a lower elevation, right? It's all going to flow downhill because of gravity. Well, as you can see now, the land might look a little bit cleaner, but unfortunately our waterways look like they have been the ones to receive all this pollution that was on the land. So things like the litter is now down in our bay. Things like plastic bags, could be other kinds of wrappers and trash and bottles. All that stuff made its way down into the bay. We also have things like our sewage, right? I'm not seeing as much manure out on the farm or any more pet waste and animal waste out here in our neighborhoods. And that's because a lot of it got washed down into the waters. Now, animal waste and pet waste and even sewage and things coming from homes and wastewater treatment facilities, they're full of nutrients, right? Kind of goes along with our fertilizer too. The waste, the sewage, and the fertilizer have lots of nutrients in it. And you know what loves nutrients? The plants love it. And there are plants in the bay, right? There's seaweed. And seaweed loves these extra nutrients too. So what happens when these nutrients end up down in the water is it allows the seaweed to really grow. We have what's called algal blooms. And they bloom so much of it that eventually some of it really can't get the sunlight and the resources that it needs, so it can start to kind of die and sink to the bottom. And when it gets down to the bottom, the bacteria love to eat it all up, and bacteria need food, which they're getting from the dead algae, but they also need a lot of oxygen. And so the animals are kind of left with not as much oxygen that they need. The bacteria is taking it all away from them. And without oxygen, these animals aren't going to be able to live in that spot. They're going to have to move elsewhere, or else they're not going to survive there. And so you may have heard about this before in the news, in the paper, or on TV. They're called fish kills because you see a lot of dead fish ending up on the shoreline. But it's not just fish that are affected, it's all the living things in the bay. What it's actually called is eutrophication, which is when there's too much nutrients and the algal blooms happen and then they die off. And so what's really important is that we need to take super good care of our land, and we also need to take care of the bay, right? And so what you do to the land has an effect on the bay. But our watershed's not all bad. It's not all about pollution. It's also important for helping the animals live in the bay because naturally they get nutrients from the land. So things like when the leaves fall in the fall and end up getting pushed into the bay. When they break down, it creates nutrients in the water for the animals to then use to survive. So the bay, Narragansett Bay, is a super productive place because it has these nutrients. And without the watershed around it to give it the nutrients, it wouldn't be as successful and as productive. So our watershed is important to help sustain life in the bay. It's also really important, though, that we take care of our watershed and you help us take care of that watershed so that we're not having any negative impacts on the water as well. Thank you so much for joining us today for another Breakfast by the Bay. We are taking a break for the holidays and we'll be returning in January. And when we return, we will be actually going back to Facebook and we'll be going live on Facebook. Again, it will be Wednesdays in January, still at 10 o'clock, but we're switching over to our Facebook platform. So make sure you find Save the Bay on Facebook and you like us and follow us so that you can catch us when we return in January. Happy holidays, everyone, and thank you for joining us.